A year before the disaster, San Francisco had already been sentenced. The sentence was printed on paper, mailed to insurance companies across the country, and signed by men who made their living calculating other people's misfortunes. The National Board of Fire Underwriters sent its inspectors to the city. They walked the streets, climbed the hills, poked through warehouse basements, studied the water supply plans, and wrote up their report. It stated that San Francisco had violated every fire safety rule the country had ever devised, and that the city had only avoided burning to the ground so far by sheer luck. The document was published in 1905. It was read, it was discussed, and then it was set aside, because the city had other things on its mind. It was getting rich. Now remember one thing, because we'll come back to it at the very end. A few days after it's all over, the city authorities will start calling what happened not an earthquake, but a fire. They'll do it relentlessly, consistently, and with full awareness of what they're doing. They'll have a very solid reason for it, and that reason cost San Francisco the truth about its own tragedy for decades to come. On April 18, 1906, at 12 minutes past 5 in the morning, the earth tore open beneath Northern California. The San Andreas Fault ruptured along nearly 300 miles. At some points along the coast, the two sides of the ground shifted 6 feet relative to each other. Fences split apart, roads snapped in two, streams began flowing the other way. Modern seismologists estimate the magnitude of the event at roughly 7.9. And here's the crucial thing to understand right away. Nearly everyone who woke up in San Francisco that morning survived the shaking. Hundreds of thousands of people got out of their homes, dusted themselves off, looked at the cracks in their walls, and decided the worst was over. They were wrong. The earthquake didn't destroy San Francisco. It only broke the one thing that could have saved the city from its real death. It shattered the water mains. The real catastrophe will begin 40 minutes later, will last 3 days, and will leave behind a wasteland of ashes covering 12 square kilometers. People had been warning about this for years, specific people with specific knowledge. One of them will be mortally wounded within the first seconds of the quake. But to understand how the city arrived at that morning, we need to go back just a few hours to the evening of April 17, when San Francisco was perfectly, utterly calm. On the evening of April 17, 1906, no one in this city was thinking about disasters. San Francisco was living through the best period of its history. Over 400,000 residents, the largest city in the entire American West, and the main financial hub of the Pacific Coast. The money that had once come here from the gold fields had long since turned into banks, railroads, shipping companies, and stock exchanges. New offices opened every month. New buildings went up every year. The city had an atmosphere that's hard to describe as anything other than certainty. Not hope, not cautious optimism, certainty. People here seriously discussed that within a generation, San Francisco would become America's leading city. And looking at the numbers of that time, it was hard to argue with them. That evening, the Grand Opera House was performing Carmen. The lead role was sung by Enrico Caruso, the most famous tenor in the world, in town on tour with the Metropolitan Opera Company. The house was packed. The audience called him back again and again. After the performance, Caruso returned to his suite at the Palace Hotel, a building considered not just the finest hotel in the city, but one of the finest on the planet. The Palace had its own fire suppression system, its own water tanks on the roof, its own pumps. It was believed this building could never burn. In the hotel's lounges, well past midnight, sat men whose names the whole country knew: railroad magnates, bankers, politicians. The talk was of new lines, new loans, new parcels of land. Through the windows you could see carriages pulling away below and the last patrons leaving the restaurants. But while Upper San Francisco was finishing its evening, Lower San Francisco was already starting its workday. In the port, ships from Asia and the East Coast were being unloaded. Stevedores worked by lantern light. In the fog that crept in from the bay every night, and settled on the cobblestones. At the rail yards, trains were being made up. In the neighborhoods where Italians, Irish, Germans, and Chinese lived, bakery ovens were already burning by morning. The bread had to be in the hotels, the cafes, and the markets. Streetcar conductors were checking their cars before the first runs. This was a city machine. It ran around the clock, smoothly, without a hitch. And that very smoothness created the illusion of permanence. When something repeats every day for years on end, the human mind stops allowing for the possibility that one day it won't. And yet beneath all of it, beneath the port, the hotels, the banks, the bakeries, ran a crack that most residents of the city didn't even know existed. The San Andreas Fault runs through California from south to north for nearly 800 miles. The Pacific Plate slowly grinds along the North American Plate, a few centimeters a year, invisible to the human eye. But the edges of the fault don't slide smoothly. They catch on each other. They stick, and the strain keeps building until the grip finally gives. Here's something that needs to be said plainly, because this story is often told wrong. By 1906, science had no idea what was coming. Geologist Andrew Lawson had given the fault its name back in 1895. But at the time, he was only talking about a small stretch south of the city. No one understood its full length or its mechanics. The understanding that accumulated strain suddenly releases in a single jolt only came after the disaster. The elastic rebound theory was formulated by Harry Fielding Reid, based precisely on his study of the 1906 aftermath. So San Francisco didn't ignore the scientific earthquake warning. No such warning ever existed. But there was another warning, and that one was ignored completely deliberately. San Francisco's danger wasn't just the fault line. It was the city itself, what it was built from, and what it stood on. Let's start with what it stood on. San Francisco sits at the tip of a peninsula, squeezed between the ocean and the bay. Its steep hills, sand dunes, and marshy lowlands. When the gold rush crowds poured in, buildable land ran out almost immediately, and the city made a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. It started taking land from the water. They leveled hills, dumped sand and soil into the cove, filled in piers, shallows, and marshland. Sometimes they used whatever was at hand, construction debris, rubble, ash. And down there, beneath the future streets, ships were left behind. Dozens of vessels abandoned right in the bay during the gold rush, because their crews had run off to the diggings. Some were turned into warehouses and hotels. Others were simply scuttled and buried. In time, streets were paved over these fills, streetcar tracks laid, and whole neighborhoods built on top. The financial district, much of the area south of Market Street, stretches of the waterfront, all of it stood on ground that hadn't existed 50 years earlier. A banker walking to Montgomery Street every morning had no idea that under his shoe soles lay the remains of old piers, sand from leveled hills, and the hull of an abandoned sailing ship. And here's the question nobody asked back then, and we'll see the answer in less than an hour. What happens to loose, waterlogged fill when it starts to shake? The answer is, it stops behaving like ground. The soil particles lose their grip, water rises up between them, and what seemed like solid ground turns into something like thick liquid for a few seconds. Buildings don't so much collapse from the shaking as they sink, tilt, and slide apart, along with the soil. Today we call this phenomenon soil liquefaction. Back then it had no name, but it was already waiting beneath the blocks of San Francisco. Now, what the city was built from, the center was brick and stone. Massive, grand, expensive buildings, symbols of prosperity. They looked eternal, but the brickwork of that era was rigid and barely handled lateral stress. Under strong horizontal motion, facades simply peeled away from the frame and crashed onto the sidewalk and whole walls. The residential neighborhoods were wood. Light frame houses packed tight together, row after row, block after block, for miles. In a quake, these houses did better than brick ones. They flexed, they creaked, but most of the time they stood. But they burned, and that was the detail the insurance inspector spotted a year before the disaster. San Francisco was a giant fuel depot. Tens of thousands of wooden buildings, wooden sidewalks, wooden staircases, roof shingles. Inside, dry furniture, fabrics, paper. In warehouses, coal, kerosene, turpentine, paint, alcohol, oils. Gas lighting in thousands of homes. Stoves and kitchen ranges with brick chimneys in every building. The insurer's report wasn't abstract grumbling. It spelled out specifics. The city's water mains had weak points. Pressure in some districts was insufficient. Development was too dense. There were no gaps between blocks, and the fire department couldn't work in multiple places at once in a major blaze. The conclusion was almost mocking. The city, the insurers wrote, had survived this long against all logic. And in San Francisco, there was one man who read that report not as an insult, but as confirmation of what he'd been saying for years. His name was Dennis Sullivan. He was the chief of the San Francisco Fire Department. Sullivan knew his city better than anyone. He knew where narrow streets wouldn't let trucks maneuver. He knew which warehouses would go up first. He knew the entire firefighting system rested on a single thing, the water in the pipes. And he knew how fragile that support was. Water came to San Francisco from far away, through several main pipelines that ran up from the south, and crossed the fault line on the way, though nobody considered that a separate risk back then. Inside the city, the network was old, worn in places, and much of it ran right under those same filled grounds. For years, Sullivan pushed for one thing, a second, independent firefighting system, drawing salt water straight from the bay, with its own pumping stations and cisterns across the districts. Such a system would work even if the main water supply failed entirely. It cost money. The city administration under Mayor Eugene Schmitz was, to put it mildly, not the most spotless in American history. Investigations into bribes and kickbacks were already swirling around it. Money in this city moved fast, but usually not toward what Sullivan was proposing. His requests were cut, postponed, and cut again. By April of 1906, San Francisco had no backup system. There was Sullivan, his men, his horses, his pumps, and his hope that there'd be water in the pipes. And now the last detail, the one that really gets under your skin. The fire chief lived at the firehouse on Bush Street with his wife in an apartment right above the engine bay. And across the street stood the California Hotel, a building with a massive upper structure and a tower rising above the rooftops of the neighboring buildings. The hours were ticking toward dawn, and San Francisco was living just as it had the day before and the day before that. At 4 in the morning, most of the city was asleep. Fog lay on the rooftops and the harbor cranes, muffling sounds, blurring the streetlights. An occasional wagon rolled down the streets. On the hills, almost no windows were lit. But the city didn't stop. The port was wrapping up its night shift. In the depot, streetcars were being prepped for the morning run. Bakers were pulling the first trays from the ovens. Vendors were setting out their goods. Patrol officers from the local precinct were making their rounds. In the hospitals, night nurses were handing off to the day shift. In the hotels downtown, hundreds of guests were asleep. Businessmen, out-of-towners, performers. Enrico Caruso was asleep in his room at the Palace after a triumphant evening. At the firehouse on Bush Street, Dennis Sullivan was asleep. There was no siren in the city, no warning, not the slightest sign of what was about to happen. There wasn't a single person who could have stepped into the street and shouted for people to get out of their homes. For those sleeping in those houses, it was just an ordinary Wednesday night. They had plans for the day ahead. Someone was going to sign a contract. Someone was waiting for a steamship. Someone had to take the kids to school. The bakeries were already pulling the first trays from the ovens because by 7 in the morning, the bread had to be sitting in the cafes on Market Street. 10 to 5. 5 to 5. 5 o'clock. Some of those working out on the streets at that moment later recalled a strange sensation. something like a gap in the familiar background noise. Horses in the stables were getting restless. Dogs across the city started barking almost in unison, minutes before anything else. 5:10. 5:11. San Francisco had about 60 seconds left of being the city it had always been. The first jolt came at 12 minutes past 5. It was short and sharp. People later described it as one violent jerk that sent things toppling off shelves and doors swinging open. Many woke up from that jolt, and in the first instant figured it was just a typical California earthquake, the kind that hits a few times a year. About 25 seconds passed. That's exactly how long it took the rupture to travel the full length of the fault line and reach the city. And then it really hit. The main shock lasted about 42 seconds. 42 seconds. Less time than a phone call takes. In that time, San Francisco stopped being the city everyone knew. People it caught in their beds all told the same story. Beds sliding across rooms, wardrobes toppling, glass blowing out of window frames, plaster raining down from the ceilings. Standing was impossible. All you could do was hold on to something and wait. Many recalled not being able to tell which way the ground was moving. The floor wasn't shifting sideways or upward, but seemed to go in every direction at once. But what struck the survivors most wasn't the motion. It was the sound. They compared it to an endless train running right under the house, to a mine collapse, to the roar of walls coming down, the screech of bending metal, and the ring of thousands of panes of glass, all at once, from every direction, without a pause. One man who was out on the street at that moment later wrote that the pavement beneath him moved in waves you could see with your own eyes, like the surface of water, and that he never forgot the sight for the rest of his life. Now let's come back to the question we asked earlier. What happens to ground that didn't exist 50 years ago? The answer came in exactly those 42 seconds. The neighborhoods built on filled-in bays and marshland were hit many times harder than those standing on the solid rock of the hills. The fill beneath them behaved like liquid. The ground sank, swelled, and split apart. Streets cracked and pulled apart. Streetcar rails bent into arcs, some of them literally twisted into loops. Sidewalks rose up, dropped down, shifted sideways. The worst hit was the district south of Market Street, a densely built working-class neighborhood of cheap wooden tenements, boarding houses, and hotels. They stood on filled ground. When it liquefied, 4- and 5-story buildings folded and toppled over whole. One hotel sank into the liquefied soil so deep that its lower floors ended up underground. That's where the most people died, not in the wealthy center, but in the neighborhoods where the people who unloaded the docks and drove the streetcars lived. Many of them never made it out from under the rubble. In the financial district, brick and stone facades peeled away and crashed into the streets in solid sheets. The buildings that embodied San Francisco's prosperity turned into dangerous, gutted shells in 40 seconds. The new City Hall, which the city had poured enormous money into and spent nearly 3 decades building, crumbled so badly that all that was left was a metal frame with a dome sitting in a pile of debris. It would later come out that the contractors had cut corners on materials during construction, and that was part of the same system that had denied Sullivan his backup water supply. Caruso woke up in the palace because the bed was shaking violently beneath him. He ran into the hallway in whatever he was wearing, terrified, and the first thing he did once he reached the street was try to check whether he'd lost his voice. He stood among the rubble and sang. His voice was intact. The singer made his way back inside, gathered his things, got to the ferry, and left San Francisco, vowing he would never return. He kept his word, and on Bush Street something happened that decided the fate of the city. The massive top section of the California Hotel collapsed. Part of it crashed through the roof of the firehouse across the street, directly above the apartment of the fire chief. The floor gave way under Dennis Sullivan. He fell down through the building, suffering catastrophic injuries. The one man in San Francisco who had spent years preparing for exactly this day, who knew every weak spot in every neighborhood, and who was supposed to lead the city's defense against fire, was taken out of action in the very first seconds. He never truly regained consciousness and died a few days later, never knowing what had happened to his city. The San Francisco Fire Department lost its commander at the exact moment it needed him most in its entire history. And then the shaking stopped, and a silence fell that survivors described as deafening. Dust from the collapsed buildings rose over the city like a solid curtain, and the dawn filtered through it in a murky yellow light. People streamed into the streets, barefoot, in nightclothes, clutching blankets. Some rushed to dig through the rubble where voices could be heard. Someone just stood and watched their own home. Neighbors gathered in clusters, trading news, counting their loved ones. It was terrifying. But along with the fear came relief. It was over. The ground had stopped moving. Homes were damaged, but they could be fixed. Family was alive. The city had held. That feeling lasted about half an hour. The first plumes of smoke were spotted almost immediately, across different districts, in several places at once. The causes were utterly mundane. Chimney flues. The city had tens of thousands of them, and nearly all were damaged. Brick chimneys are rigid, so they crack and crumble at the first strong jolt. But by that hour, fires were already burning in the stoves, bakers, early cooks, duty stokers. When a flue splits, flames and embers go straight into the wooden framing. Add to that overturned kerosene lamps, snapped and shorted electrical wires, shattered bottles of chemicals in pharmacies and workshops, and ruptured gas mains, now venting gas under pressure. By various estimates, within the first hour or two, about 50 separate fires had broken out across the city. On its own, that wasn't a death sentence. San Francisco's fire department was considered one of the best in the country. Crews rolled out immediately, horses picking their way over cracked pavement and debris, taking detours around blocked streets to reach the flames. They ran out their hoses, hooked up to hydrants, opened the valves, and nothing happened. A thin trickle came from the nozzles, then a few drops, then nothing. Firemen moved to the next hydrant. Same result. The next block over, dry. The earthquake had shattered San Francisco's water system in hundreds of places. The trunk lines feeding the city were torn apart where they crossed the fault. The street network inside the city had shifted with the ground, especially on those landfill zones. Water from the reservoirs drained into the earth, and pressure dropped across the entire system at once. What Dennis Sullivan had warned the administration about for years happened exactly as he'd described. A city utterly dependent on a single system lost that system in 42 seconds. The backup, the one that would draw salt water from the bay, had never been built. Firemen found themselves in a position almost impossible to imagine, standing before growing flames with useless equipment in their hands. All that remained were hand axes, pike poles, and whatever could be hauled by bucket from surviving cisterns, wells, and stable troughs. A few crews tried pumping water from the sewer lines. In some spots, fireboats helped, pumping straight from the bay, but their hoses only reached the waterfront strip. By 9 in the morning, the separate fires began to merge. One of them went down in history under a name that sounds almost absurd next to the scale of what followed. In the Hayes Valley neighborhood, a woman decided to make breakfast for her family, a normal thing to do the morning after a shock, when you want to feel like life is back to normal. She lit the stove, not knowing her chimney had cracked in the quake. The fire went into the wall. The blaze that started with that breakfast came to be called the Ham and Eggs Fire. It burned Hayes Valley, jumped further, and reached City Hall, finishing what the earthquake had started. One breakfast, dozens of blocks, that pretty much sums up what was happening. The city could no longer afford a single household mishap. Any spark now meant a whole block. By midday on April 18th, San Francisco wasn't burning in patches anymore. It was burning in fronts. Individual fires merged into single masses, and those masses began to behave differently from from ordinary fire. Superheated air rose, pulling fresh air in from below, and the flames created their own wind. That kind of fire doesn't move down a street, it leaps across it. It hurls burning debris hundreds of feet ahead and ignites rooftops far in front of the front. There was no shortage of fuel. Blocks of wooden houses stood shoulder to shoulder, with no gaps between buildings, exactly what the insurers had written about in 1905. People fled. Often they had 15 or 20 minutes to pack. They grabbed documents, money, photographs, children. Many dragged trunks and suitcases over broken pavement, mile after mile, until their strength gave out, and then they left them right there in the street. Some hauled their belongings in baby carriages. Some carried the elderly on their backs. Crowds moved in three directions: west, toward Golden Gate Park and the Presidio, where there was open ground; south, toward the outskirts; and east, to the docks, where ferries carried people across the bay to Oakland and Berkeley. The ferry companies ran around the clock and charged nothing. In a matter of days, more than 200,000 people were evacuated that way, half the city. As people were leaving, the army was marching in. Brigadier General Frederick Funston commanded the troops at the Presidio. Formally, he had no authority to send soldiers into the city without orders from above, and there was no contact with Washington. Funston made the call himself, on his own authority, and by morning soldiers were marching in columns toward the center. Judgments of his actions split immediately, and they're still split today. The military helped evacuate people, clear rubble, guard banks and the mint, set up field kitchens and tent camps. Without them, the chaos would have been worse. But at the same time, the city had effectively come under military control with no legal procedure whatsoever. Major Eugene Schmitz issued a proclamation that was printed and posted all over the city. It stated that soldiers, police, and special patrols were ordered to shoot on sight anyone caught looting or committing other crimes. It was an order to shoot without trial. It had no legal force. The mayor had no such authority. But under those circumstances, it worked. Exactly how many people died as a result is still unknown to this day. There are documented cases of people being shot for trying to carry belongings out of their own homes. There are accounts of people killed for refusing forced labor clearing rubble. Many such cases were never investigated. The city had other things to deal with. But the most controversial measure of all was dynamite. The idea was logical and in theory sound. If you can't put out a fire, you stop it. To do that, they create fire breaks, tearing down a row of buildings in the fire's path, so the front runs into open space and burns itself out. The problem was the execution. The people tasked with the demolitions mostly had no experience with explosives in an urban setting. Charges were placed wrong, and yields were estimated by eye. Buildings didn't collapse inward. They blew apart, scattering burning debris into neighboring blocks. And when the dynamite started running low, they switched to black powder. That was the worst thing they could have done. Black powder produces a long flame when detonated. Using it in a wooden city meant arson, and the city burned because of what was meant to save it. Entire swaths of blocks, including the area around the mansions on Nob Hill, caught fire precisely because of the demolitions. Artillerymen later fired on buildings with cannons, trying to bring them down without explosives. There's no reliable data on how many buildings were destroyed by the fire versus how many by the attempts to stop it. Chinatown burned to the ground, the oldest and largest Chinese community in the United States. And here's where something happened that people preferred not to talk about for years. Even before the ashes cooled, some city leaders saw an opportunity in the disaster. Chinatown's land sat right in the center, was worth a fortune, and the idea emerged to relocate the Chinese community to the far outskirts, to Hunter's Point. The plans were drawn up in all seriousness. Nothing came of it. The community's own resistance, diplomatic pressure from the Chinese side, and not least, plain commercial calculation. The city quickly realized how much money Chinatown brings in. The neighborhood was rebuilt on the same spot. There was another story, too, the kind that shows what a person can be on a day like that. A young banker named Amedeo Giannini ran a small bank serving Italian immigrants, people the big institutions wouldn't lend to at all. On the morning of April 18th, he made it into the city from the suburbs, realized the fire was heading for his office, and hauled out all the cash and gold on 2 carts, covering them with crates of oranges so as not to draw attention. While the big banks stayed shut, their vaults had heated up in the blaze and couldn't be opened for weeks. Giannini put a plank across 2 barrels right at the wharf and started doing business. He handed out money on a handshake, writing names in a notebook to people who had no collateral, no documents, no home left. Almost all of it came back to him. His bank grew out of that day and eventually became what we now call the Bank of America. The city burned for 3 days. At night, the glow was visible from ships far out at sea. By day, the column of smoke rose so high it was spotted dozens of miles away. In the city itself, the streets were covered in a thick layer of ash, and the air was so hot that some blocks were simply impossible to walk through. The fire stopped by April 21st. It wasn't so much people who stopped it as a combination of factors: a shift in the wind, fire breaks finally done right along the wide streets, moist air coming in off the ocean, and the fact that the burned-out areas had simply run out of fuel. When the smoke cleared, the city saw itself. About 490 blocks had burned. More than 28,000 buildings were destroyed. The area of the ashes spanned roughly 12 square kilometers. Nearly the entire downtown, the financial district, a large part of the residential neighborhoods, Chinatown, and the blocks south of Market Street. Between 225 and 250,000 people were left homeless, more than half the city. People lived in tent camps in Golden Gate Park and the Presidio, cooked at communal kitchens, and stood in line for bread. Later, thousands of tiny wooden cottages were built for them, painted green and rented out for a symbolic fee that counted toward purchase. Some of those cottages were later moved by residents to new lots, and a few still stand in San Francisco today, hidden inside later renovations. Now we come back to where we started, to the question of how many people died and why the city so carefully called what happened a fire. The official figures announced by authorities right after the disaster were first around 375 dead, then 478. Those numbers were a lie, and that was clear even then. The count didn't include Chinatown residents. Chinese casualties were systematically ignored in those years. It didn't include those who couldn't be identified. It didn't include those who died later from injuries or from disease outbreaks in the camps. It didn't include a large share of the dead in the blocks south of Market Street, where collapsed tenements burned with the people still trapped underneath. There was simply no one and nothing left to count. It didn't include those listed as missing and never found. Decades later, city archivist Gladys Hansen began pulling together archives, lists, records, newspapers, correspondence, and family documents. The work took years. Her final estimate of the death toll, around 3,000 people. The difference between 478 and 3,000 is not a statistical margin of error. It's a decision, and here's the reason for that decision. Earthquake and fire are 2 fundamentally different words for insurance companies and for investors. Policies of the time covered fire damage. Earthquake damage, as a rule, they did not. But it wasn't just about insurance payouts. It was about the future. A fire can happen in any city in the world. Chicago burned, Boston burned, Baltimore burned, and they all rebuilt. A fire is an accident. An earthquake is a property of the place. If you admit that San Francisco stands on ground that can tear apart at any moment, capital will leave forever. The banks will leave, the insurers will leave, the settlers will leave. A city that spent 20 years building itself as the capital of the West Coast would turn into a cautionary tale. So the city's political and business leaders took a line they stuck to with remarkable consistency. The Great Fire had happened. Official reports, advertisements, brochures for visitors, correspondence with Eastern investors. Everywhere, the emphasis shifted from the ground to the fire. The death toll was downplayed. The damage from the shaking was described as minor. The campaign worked. The money came back. Construction began almost immediately, and within 9 years, San Francisco was hosting a World's Fair, as proof that the city had fully recovered. The price of that decision wasn't paid in dollars. It was paid in the fact that the real numbers wouldn't come out for nearly a century, in the fact that thousands of dead didn't exist in any official record for a long, long time, and in the fact that the lessons about building on filled land were learned far more slowly than they should have been. But there was another side to it too. It was precisely after 1906 that the science of earthquakes stopped being merely descriptive. The state created a commission led by the very same Andrew Lawson who had given the fault its name. The commission traveled the entire rupture line, measured the displacements, gathered eyewitness accounts, and in 1008 published a report that became the foundation of 20th century seismology. It was in that work that Harry Fielding Reid formulated the elastic rebound theory, the explanation of how the Earth's crust accumulates strain and then releases it in a single jolt. In other words, humanity's very understanding of what happened to San Francisco exists only because it happened to San Francisco. Practical conclusions followed later. Building codes were introduced that restricted construction without accounting for seismic risk. Over time, soil maps were drawn up, and it became clear which neighborhoods would fare worst in the next big quake. How accurate those maps were got tested in 1909, when the Loma Prieta earthquake struck. The hardest hit parts of San Francisco then were the Marina district and the areas around the bay, built, as you might guess, on filled land. In the Marina, the fill was made partly from the rubble left over from the 1906 disaster. The city literally built new vulnerability out of the ruins of the old. More than 100 years have passed. San Francisco still stands. Millions of people walk its streets, and almost none of them think about what happened here one April morning. The financial district is packed with skyscrapers no banker of 1906 could have imagined. Chinatown is right where it always was. The ferries still cross the bay. Little remains of the old city. The surviving buildings on the hills where the fire never reached. Cemetery records. Photographs of people in hats and long coats standing on Market Street, staring at the smoke. Almost everything that destroyed San Francisco was known in advance. It was known that the city was built of wood and packed tight together. It was known that some neighborhoods were built on land reclaimed from the bay. It was written in black and white that the water system wouldn't survive a serious test, and that the city's entire fire defense depended on a single system. There was a man who spent years demanding a second one, and who wasn't asking for much. The only thing that wasn't known was when. The insurer's report didn't include a date, and Sullivan's estimate included a price tag, and the people comparing them had to weigh a cost today against a fire someday. 42 seconds. That's all it took to turn the most self-assured city in America into a place where hundreds of thousands of people slept on the grass in a park. The system Dennis Sullivan had asked for, the city eventually built a separate pipeline running on salt water from the bay, with its own pumping stations and neighborhood cisterns. It's still in operation in San Francisco today, and at downtown intersections, its underground cisterns are marked by circles of bricks set right into the asphalt. People walk across them every day. Sullivan died a few days after the quake, never regaining consciousness and never knowing. On the evening of April 17, 1906, San Francisco's theaters and restaurants were packed. People were making plans for tomorrow. Ships were being unloaded at the port. Ovens were burning in the bakeries. A famous tenor was taking his bows to thunderous applause. None of them knew they were living the last evening of the city they'd woken up in that morning.